Hello and welcome to part 4 of 1980s Royal Navy Long Patrol. It's a fun thing to discuss, and it's certainly a lot of fun to look at. Let's go to... not... Why is that what I have? Expert, you sometimes have a mind of your own. Anyway, so this is part 4, the strategic situation. Sort of. And I have to say it is sort of because... well... I have fun with it. So, we started off by looking parts 1 through to 3, looked at the debate of the 1980 about what the Royal Navy was. And they defined the missions as Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and the Northern Barrier, resupply across the Atlantic, special forces, nuclear deterrent, out-of-area capability. And therefore, what do these think areas require? Well, they require an anti-submarine force. That's the preeminent one they require because of the Soviet strength. They require task group air defense, again, because of bombers and because of the Soviet missiles. Okay, so we know we're going to need destroyers. We know we're going to need ASW. We've got Invincible class carriers coming along, which theoretically Sea Harrier provides your outer air defense, and carrier has along the Sea Kings on it. So, you know, that's your through deck cruiser, baby carrier, anti-submarine warfare ship, and air defense. It's got limited role. It's got limited force, but it's got limited roles. It's not designed as something which is going to be used as a strike asset primarily. It's designed for air defense of the fleet and for anti-submarine warfare. It's limited. No one wanted to pay for any more, so that's what they got. Amphibious assault and lift, because that's how you're going to do Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. I'd always love the fact that people go, well, Norway was allocated this much force, but there was this force allocated to Denmark. And there was a force allocated to Denmark. And it had tanks. Yes, it did. But it was going to probably require the same equipment to get to Denmark as it would get to Norway, because... and here's the dirty little secret. So, theory is often put, yes, we're going to be resupplying an allied nation into ports. Well, there are a limited number of ports, and believe it or not, it's quite, unless you've got a lot of air defense missiles, it's quite easy to start damaging port infrastructure with enough bombers and missiles and tanks. So, you have the scenario goes with, we'll have mounted up and we'll have offloaded before war began. Well, that's a lovely idea on paper, and it's something which often politicians and some strategic leaders will hide behind. But the reality is, I've got an incredibly tense international situation between two nuclear alliances, into which I'm going to carry out my war plan. One of those sides is going to decide I'm going to carry out what is my war plan. Reinforcement of these key areas. Yeah, that's intentions. One of the things when you're talking about strategic nuclear deterrent, whenever you're talking about the strategic nuclear deterrent, is the continuous at-sea deterrence. There is always someone who comes up with the idea, but we could do it with 1 or 2 boats, and then, we just deploy it when we needed to. So you've got an incredibly complicated, incredibly high-stakes situation, and you're going to deploy your nuclear ballistic missile submarine? That's going to lower tensions, isn't it? But saying you've got your submarines already at sea, they are a fact of life, they're already there, provides a thing of, right then, we have nuclear weapons, they're survivable. You can't really take them out short of a lot of luck. So, or a technology which we don't know exists. So, you want to talk? That's fine. So that's we want to talk and smooth the situation out. But what we're going to do is, while we're doing it, is we're going to deploy. We're either going to try and deploy it secretly. That's going to work in the age of modern social media. Or, well, it would have worked in the 1960s or 70s. No. Or we're not going to deploy, in which case it's sitting in its port and it's the first thing you're going to take out if you decide to do a first strike. So either have a continuous at sea deterrence or don't have a deterrence. There is really no middle ground if you're Britain, and that's what you have. There is none. People go, oh, we could have air launched. Really not a good idea. You know, the accidents which have happened with air launch, and considering Britain does not have the largest air force in the world, and honestly, at this point, considering the infrastructure we have in place to build ballistic missile submarines and maintain ballistic missile submarines, we'd have to get rid of all that and build up the infrastructure to launch and maintain heavy bombers. Ay, caramba. We basically end up having to join the American B-21 program. That's the only option. So, going back to it, basically the idea of them mounting up and then going straight out to going out there, just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So, if you can't do the mount up before, then you have to expect that there's going to be some degradation of port facilities before you get there, which is why you have the amphibious facilities. Now, there is all sorts of arguments always made about the viability of amphibious assaults. The most recent examples we have are the Al-4 Peninsula, invasion of Afghanistan, and the Falklands War, really, from a Western perspective. And all have had variable examples of success. In fact, all have had success, but, you know, they face variable levels of threat. The constant thread amongst them, is that these forces tend to land outside of the particular area of enemy concentration, and then, once massed, move in or join up with forces coming on land or etc. They're securing facilities, securing things and moving in. They're not usually trying to directly secure a port, although Al-4 does actually end up securing a port. It's a case of we're first landing, and then the amphibious operation on land will take the port from land. What am I trying to say here? Well, amphibious forces are about giving you the option. But if we are going to start suggesting that you can no longer seriously suggest that you can no longer do amphibious operations because of the strength of the enemy forces in defense, and I would remind everyone that there have been several points at which people have declared war as we know it is over because of the strength of defenses. The Maginot Line prior to World War II, various arguments about artillery, barbed wire, and machine guns acting in combination during actually the First World War, where it was despaired and was just going to be various things repeating ad infinitum. It happens. The defensive gets strong, then the offensive gets strong. Then the defensive gets strong, then the offensive gets strong. I'm not being glib. Basically, you have cycles where it seems one side has the strength and then the other side has the strength because they respond. You know, at the moment we're all talking about missiles and the swarm of drones. In a few years' time, especially if they manage to get things together correctly, we might well be talking about now the power of lasers on ships and how this has freed up VLS tubes to take the offensive weaponry because the lasers will destroy all the missiles. And then a few years after that, we'll probably be talking about very, very smart missiles, probably, which have some form of shielding to protect themselves from lasers. And now will the lasers be enough? Do we have to reintroduce SAMs? It will go on, and then there'll be rail guns at some point, because I'm fairly sure at some point they will get it working. The science checks out. It's the sheer quantity of energy you're dealing with and trying to manipulate. That's the problem at the moment, which means it's probably a job of metallurgy. So, you have the amphibious equipment because you're not going to be able to mount up in peacetime. You're going to have to do it properly once the war has started, and you're going to be going into places which have probably already been bombed. Sorry. So, submarines, of course, for deterrence and for anti-submarine warfare operations. And then we have the reason NATO exists, the global alliance. Not just of NATO, but of NATO's pals. You have Five Eyes and Five Powers, that are two different alliances represented in here. They're all listed as other allies of the United States. Well, usually they are allies, but some of them are the formal alliances they're in actually do not contain the United States, but contain other members of NATO. France has a fair number of those. Britain has a fair number of those. One of the interesting things is when you look at this map and you go, hang on, there are some Commonwealth countries which are in grey here. The odds are Commonwealth countries, if they go one way or the other, will probably end up heading towards neutral if they're not going to join the Allies or join the Allies. For example, Egypt. As much as the Soviet Union was always trying to get that firmly into their camp, as I've discussed before, Egypt always plays by its own rules. And I would argue Turkey, which is in solidly blue here, is another one which plays by its own rules. They have their own strategic agreement reasons, and that's what they're going for. Again, the Middle East, they have many, many other reasons for doing things. And South America is always an interesting area to get into when you're talking about NATO. But this is the context of Britain and of Britain's decision-making in the 1980s. You'll notice there is one big country in blue here. It is presumed that because Argentina is an ally of the United States, that they are friendlier with Britain. But of course, Britain ends up deciding that it's going to withdraw its Antarctic patrol ship. It's cutting ship, frigates, it's cutting this, it's cutting that. And it's looking like it's turning inward and weak and all these sort of things, and they seize their chance. It's dealing with economic issues it's coming out of. Seriously, the amount of times that history, people go, history. It doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Sometimes you can feel a little bit repetitive as a historian. Anyway, let's expand this to a massive size and click on to the next slide. Because the next slide is the other part of the strategic scenario. You can have the lovely thing, which is the geography, but here is the facts. And 1971, 1981, 1983. This is published in 1984. Now, it's carefully skipped out 79, 77, 75, 73, to try and show a general progression, mainly because they would repeat and repeat again. So, in 1981, 1983. You have 7 aircraft carriers, including Vistal carriers. In NATO, 1983, you're going to have 10. In 1971, you had 9. That doesn't sound good. The major difference in the force here going on, up and down in NATO, it's the Royal Navies. And it's the forces in the North Atlantic and seas bordering Europe. So it doesn't include the US forces, which are not there. We have the Russians' Kiev-class ships, which are, of course, aircraft-carrying cruisers, or heavy aviation cruisers. They are not the aircraft carrier, you're not. Well, meet the Invincible class, they're through-deck cruisers. Then we have the helicopter carriers, which, of course, in the Russian case, and Warsaw Pact, are the Moskva class. Yes, cute. Cruisers. As we can see, the Warsaw Pact outnumbers NATO quite considerably. 20 to 11 in 1971, 21 to 15 in 1981, and 23 to 14 in 1983. And at this rate, with the Tickerongeras being got rid of, I'm fairly sure China and Russia will not only be outnumbering, but we're outnumbering many, many numbers to 1, or by a significant ratio, in other words, cruisers very shortly. Destroyers and frigates. NATO, 381 in 1971, 274 in 1981, so they've dropped down by over 100, to be precise, 107 in 10 years. They've gone down. 107. In 1983, it's going to be 277, so it's going to go up by 3. Well, hey! In that same time, Warsaw Pact, mainly Russia, i.e. Soviet Union, has gone up from 142 to 187. Now, they are doing this whilst decommissioning some of their older ships, strange enough for the Warsaw Pact. So they've gone up by 45 in the same time. And coastal escorts and fast patrol boats. Well, this is the really interesting thing, because actually the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, is going down. They're reducing from 553 in 1971 to 551 in 1981, but apparently in 1983 they're going to be at 515, so there's a whole 36 going. Don't worry though, they'll still outnumber the NATO forces by 2 to 1, because they're going to peak at 192. That's so cute. Then you see the real difference that comes from this geography, because in amphibious ships, ocean going, NATO 24, 41, 44 by 1983. Warsaw Pact 7, 16, 19. But independent coastal craft, like large landing craft, etc., NATO peaking at 69 as of 1981 and still there in 1983. Warsaw Pact 190, 150 in 1971, 155 in 1981, and back up to 174 in 1983. There you go to rearms the Warsaw Pact. That's great fun. But of course, amphibious warfare in the 1980s is not going to be happening anymore. It's too dangerous. Because of our enemy, the same enemy who's building a large number of amphibious ships. It's amazing. Mine warfare. Well, this is a fairly consistent terrible. Okay? 349 in 1971 for NATO. They're going to drop down to 257 in 1981, rise up to 273 in 1983. But the Warsaw Pact, 374, I'm going to say that's 360, and 378. Yeah, that's a fairly decent number of consistency. Total submarines, all types. NATO, 195, down to 190 in 1981, and up to 197 in 1983. Warsaw Pact, 248 in 1971. They're going to peak at 258 in 1981, but be down to 246 again in 1983. Dang those nuclear submarines, they actually need to be retired. So ballistic missile submarines, you've got 38 and then 35 with one in construction. On the NATO side, on the Warsaw Pact, you have 38 with one in construction in 1971, 52 with one in construction in 1981, and 1983, 49 with one in construction. So they've got 3 less than they had, but they still have 14 more. And they're all Soviet Union. Long-range attack submarines. 72, 60, and 67 is the NATO stats. In 1983, it's 67. In Warsaw Pact, it's 115, 149, 142. Yes, we can keep telling ourselves that our submarines are better than theirs, but we're still going to have to take, each submarine is going to have to account for 2 at any one time. And remember, of course, that's as long as that we choose when to go to war. If they choose a point when we've got a further, they've managed to ramp up their in-service time, and we haven't managed to ramp ours up in service, we're in troubles. Other types of submarines. 85, 95, and 95 in NATO. 95, 57, and 55 in Warsaw Pact. Percentage of submarines nuclear powered. 50% is the rough average for NATO. It does dip down to 49% in 1981, but it's then up to 50% again. In the Soviet Union, it's 64% by 1983, 45% in 1981, and 32% in 1971. That is quite a dramatic change around. Sea-based tactical anti-submarine warfare and support aircraft, including helicopters. NATO will drop from 801 in 1971 to 685 in 1983. Warsaw Pact will increase from 36 in 1971 to 181 in 1983. Land-based tactical and support aircraft, including helicopters. For NATO, it's 112 in 1971, but you'll be glad to know it's got the 366 by 1983. But Warsaw Pact, it's gone from 521 in 1971 to 700 in 1983, having peaked at 719 in 1981. Of which about 300 are bombers. Ouch. Can I just say the ouch again? Land-based anti-submarine warfare fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters. NATO, 471 in 1971, dropping to 450 in 1981, but going back up to 454. You know how to climb that mountain in 1983. Warsaw Pact, 225 in 1971. Down to 179 in 1981, but back up to 228 in 1983. I'm not sure what happened in those 2 years, but obviously someone put a spurt on. And here is from the report that picture comes from, which is the 1984 NATO and Warsaw Pact Force Comparisons. I actually accessed this last week, but I also accessed it again today and accessed it again on the weekend. So I could have put down 3 days worth of access, or I could just put down February 2021. So that's why that's in there. NATO Naval Forces. There have been major qualitative improvements in individual naval units and supporting systems of NATO navies, which are reflected both in new construction and modernization programs. Included among such improvements are the capabilities of shipborne aircraft, anti-surface missiles, anti-submarine warfare detection systems, command and control, electronic warfare, and submarine noise suppression. The strategic missile submarine forces have been enhanced with the introduction of the higher class submarines and the Trident missile systems. Despite these improvements, the high cost of ship construction has set a trend towards less than 1-for-1 replacement. There you go. That's the ouch. Governments have a choice, and it's a hard choice. It's not easy. What do you fund? Because you can say, right then, oh, well, you should just spend more money. Well, where does the money come from? Governments have two sources of money: taxation and borrowing. And remember, borrowing is just taxation deferred. Because the borrowing has to be paid back at some point, and that's going to come from taxes. So really, governments only have one source of money: taxation. For that, they provide a range of services in return for you giving them your money. They administer, they provide education, infrastructure, basic rule of law, security, healthcare, whatever. We've been through in our previous videos list of things that they can provide. Where do you get the money from? What do you cut? Because let's put it this way. Let's say you cut healthcare to fund defense. It's a baby killer government. Look, it's cutting money to support babies at home to kill babies abroad. You can see the headlines. Sorry for the emotive language. They raise taxes. Everyone's going to be moaning. Everyone always is. It's one of my biggest arguments against when I have with people whenever they offer the glib answer to any solution of we must raise taxes. Go, is that going to make anyone happy? No. And ultimately, there is actually a level of taxation at which you actually start getting less in because you make it more and more necessitate. Well, how to put it? The people who are earning the most money, the higher the tax, are more likely to invest in hiding it. So you actually, there is a taxation level at which it makes more economical sense for them to pay the tax than it is to spend all the money to hide it and run the risk of being found and having that problems. There is actually a level. Someone worked it out. I think it was about 40%. It comes in at about the 40% mark. Was the scientific study. I think a guy called Alan Sykes did the research. I did meet him a couple of times. He was a very, very cool gentleman. Very nice. But he did the research, and it was an academic paper with academics and economists from all sides of the political spectrum working it out together, and they're quite shocked when they worked it out. But that was what the figure was roughly about. And okay, so that means there's a fixed amount of money you can get from. And if you're going to do a progressive taxation system, you're not going to tax the poorest earners at 40%. So you can't really say you're going to take a 40% tax. And then you've got your corporation tax, which again is highly competitive because corporations move around like nobody's business. If it'll save money so they can return money to their shareholders. Because guess what? It's a corporation's first job. Is it to pay tax? No. Is it to fund your infrastructure? No. Corporations' first duty is to their shareholders to provide a profit so they can provide a return on their investment. There's nothing bad about that. That is just what they are. They're neither good nor bad. Now, some companies are very ethical and have a very much a social conscience, and they do invest in these things, but I would argue quite a lot of those companies which do it do enjoy the fact that they have very good PR as a result. And I'm sure the public relations and benefits have nothing to do with all their decision making on this front at all. I'm sure it doesn't. Sorry, cynicism of years of being involved in military and naval history, military history, and defense. And yeah, there's a lot of cynicism goes on. So, these things get more expensive. If I'm a government and I raise the defense budget, where am I going to get that money from? But if I don't raise the defense budget, well, that means I can only afford less units to replace the ones I've already got. That's problematic. But let's put it this way. If I'm a defense minister or prime minister and I think, is there likely to be a big war in the next 4 years? Or will I back my ability, my brilliant political nous and negotiating skills to prevent a war in the next 4 or 5 years? Yes. And who knows? After then, maybe I'm no longer the prime minister. I might have retired by that point. Be writing my book. And it'll be someone else's problem. And they'll have to spend even more money if they want to rearm, because instead of it being a constant building program, it'll be a crash building program. So it'll be a glut after a famine. So they'll have to pay for all the infrastructure to be built. They'll have to pay for all the people to be trained. They have to pay for all the levels of different things that will be procured, all the long lead items to get the ships. Or they will gamble that they can keep peace. And they'll keep gambling. Because it's either that or cut something like healthcare, like education, like police, like foreign aid. Which you don't want to cut because it does good, is good, it's necessary as well, and it makes you look good. And helps you win elections. This is the debate that's running through Britain in the 1980s. This is what will lead to the Not Review. This is what will lead to a lot of the different decisions made afterwards and after the Falklands War. And this is why ships aren't replaced number for number. And also why when ships are got rid of, they are very rarely replaced. Because it's successive governments. And here's the other thing, if I'm a government, and I want to spend money on things which are more likely to be vote winners for me than spending on defence, despite the logic of the employment and the investment and the infrastructure and the technology and the good paying and quite well paying jobs that defence, especially defence manufacturer, tends to provide. If let's say the Navy hasn't had has managed to last a few years without those 4 ships, well, I can spend the money on those 4 ships now, or I could get rid of them, or I could get rid of another 4 ships and use the new ships. Then I don't cancel the new ships. What 4 ships will I cut? What will be the oldest 4 ships? Okay, if you cut the 4 Type 23s and you've got a new government dealing with Type 31s coming in and Type 3, we'll cut the Type 45s. You can already hear the maths going through people's heads. Because you only need 2 for a carrier battle group, so if you cut the other 4, but the reason the government's cutting, because they want to invest in things. And it's not unusual. They've had huge bills for COVID. They've had huge bills in Britain currently for Brexit. In the 1980s, they are dealing with huge bills left over from the 1970s and from World War II. They have industries which are massively inefficient. And the trouble is, you can get too focused on efficiency. And as I said before, defense is inherently inefficient in peacetime. It's very efficient in wartime. It's exactly what you want. But it looks very wasteful in peacetime when not much is happening. It's incredibly wasteful. After all, surely if you've got 1 air defense destroyer, why do you need 2 with a carrier battle group? Surely 1 anti-submarine warfare frigate is enough. It's an anti-submarine warfare frigate. They're all the same. Oh, well, you need them on different points of the compass? Why? They've got great sensors. They can detect the golf balls many, many miles away. Surely you can do that with one destroyer? And then the money's free to spend on hospitals, education, infrastructure, or to pay back loans, which means you don't have to do tax rises. It's not bad. I'm not saying they're bad people. That's not the case. It's just politics. It's what you get in a democracy. And it's one of the reasons why, again, you only start to get funding in things like defence, which aren't peacetime vote winners, if you take them out of the short-term arguments. So, if you take procurement and force structure out of the short term, and which was the idea that the reviews, the quadrennial reviews, were going to do this. They were going to take them beyond it. But they've been left in the control of government rather than the control of Parliament. So Parliament doesn't review, Parliament doesn't then vote, and the government isn't then responsible. Because it's quite simple, because government has to run the administration of the procurement. It has to run the day-to-day operations and give the and interact the strategy. So you can understand why it's not. But if force structure and procurement are the subject of an independent parliamentary report, recommendations, and parliamentary vote, it might introduce a little bit more long-term thinking into it, because it suddenly won't be a minister's purview to offer it up, or a chancellor's purview to get rid of it. Because it'd be a case of, that was the act passed. That was the review was done by this at the beginning of this Parliament, and the vote was made at the beginning of this Parliament. It's the first order of business, and that's what we have to stick to until there's another election. But that's going well off topic. Let's go on to the next slide, which you have seen a bit earlier, because, well, here's the thing. I was going to do a nice discussion about Soviet versus Western missiles, because the Soviets tend to use navalized versions of their land-based missiles for their defense at sea. But I couldn't find a similar chart. So if anyone knows where one exists for the for the Western navies, NATO ones, I'd be overjoyed. I really would be. Because currently, this is, as I said, Soviet SAMs and, well, ABMs as well, anti-ballistic missiles. You have the Barnov SAM, which was the first Soviet anti-aircraft barrage rocket, fired in limited numbers during the siege of Leningrad, and downed 2 German aircraft. Barnov is otherwise known as the R-101. Yep, it's that. Well, it looks like some sort of rocket from Flash Gordon. It really does. Then we have the R-102, post-World War II Russian version of the German Zeppelin surface-to-air missile. Not put in production. Cancelled in favour of the R-112, which is... I think also there, isn't it? Let me see, because I've got my list. No, it's not up there, unfortunately. But that was the R102. Then there's the R117, which is developed again in competition to the R12, and again counts in favour of the R12. It's funny, on my list I have a picture in front of me of the R112, but on there I do not. That's annoying. Anyway. The R112 is really the first Soviet surface-to-air missile designed, and it's 1948-51 designed. Propulsion and guidance were based on that of the R102, the Schmetterling, with new aerodynamics. It was cancelled in 1951 without ever flying, but allowed them the Soviets to proceed with a new generation of SAM designs. And there's all sorts of really cool stuff that the Soviets get up to, and basically, I can highly recommend. Well, honestly, the astronautics.com site where I have found all this information. It's really quite cool. Because I found a cool graphic there and I went, ooh, and then I checked stuff out. Thanks to my Palmar book, which is now in the office. Column's still got to go now. These are anti-ship missiles, and actually, this is courtesy of at Naval Graphics, which does some really, really cool stuff. And what disturbed me when I saw this was I was looking for anti-ship missiles of the 1980s, and they're still in service. They are still there. There are a few which are no longer. Seagull isn't there, and all sorts of things, but they are still there. The Granite is still there. Lynx is still there. There are a few of them which are just still in service. Still in service. Basil, still in service. Yeah, Harpoon, Exocet, Automat, Gabrielle. It's just fun. And the one thing I would say is that you have seen a lot of development of anti-ship missiles since the 1980s. Mostly in the West, these have been on perfecting existing designs. In, I would say, the communist states and the former communist states, in terms of modern Russia and China, they have been on pushing the envelope, at least publicly. It's interesting when you start looking back at some of the ideas they were theorizing in the 70s and 80s, because the designs don't reach maturity. And the traditional idea is that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the various other things mean that this stuff is all lost and Russia resets. And then you look at some designs coming out and you go, where's the reset happened? But a great, great site. And this is the point of strategy. This is from another of the NATO reports, and it tells you from America to the English Channel is 6,000 kilometers. From the Soviet Union to the English Channel, it is 1,450 kilometers. It's 6,000 kilometers to Norway. It's 6,000 kilometers to the edge of Turkey. It is a long, long way. And that is where the supplies have to come. But one of the interesting things I then found was, after this, I went hunting for free graphics for this video. I was really looking forward, because my graphics abilities are terrible. They were 3 hour relating for. One, I wanted the sounds. Two, I wanted the missiles at the time, the anti-ship missiles, to compare them. But, yeah, that didn't happen. And three, I wanted the Soviet bomber lines over the Atlantic. How far they could reach. No. I asked for force comparisons. Force comparisons which kept focusing in on the land forces, on the number of troops and divisions, and troops and brigades and strike aircraft against each other. And that is part led me to an idea, which is this. The Central Front is such a focus of NATO war that it's often forgotten, as was emphasized in some of the videos, especially the live, that the maritime sphere is a critical part of NATO. So much is focused on the number of tanks, divisions versus divisions on the ground war, that you can quite easily lose sight of the huge amount of Atlantic. And this map is really great for doing that, because that is 1,450 kilometers. And that is 6,000 kilometers. So that should really look like it's 4, or actually more than 4 times the distance. But because of the way they've drawn the map, it looks like it's merely twice. If you look at it. So, I hope you found this strategic situation analysis interesting. Basically, if we go back to the beginning, the world is complicated. Politics is complicated. Domestic politics and international politics make it really complicated. And sometimes it's very tempting to take a gamble on the international to appease the domestic, which elects you. And you're not a bad person for doing that. You merely can be accused of being perhaps short-sighted. Or you could say, actually, you could almost make the case that you are a bad politician, though. But no. 1980s Britain had one of its best politicians it's ever had as its Prime Minister. Like her or hate her, there is no doubt that Margaret Thatcher was a very, very capable politician, a very able politician. And she was making the judgment she did. Again, the problem with politicians is they all imagine they're amazing as a rule. Very few are. Take care, and hope you enjoyed this one, and hope you will stay in tune for part 5, which will focus on the Royal Navy and looking at its size and scope, and basically what it was doing, what it was made up of in the 1980s. Take care, and enjoy.
Thank you.